Hello, my name is Rebecca Fellows. I don't know my candidate number, and this is my presentation for IB Film Studies Higher Level. Today I'll be discussing the 2006 Spanish-Mexican dark fantasy film Pan's Labyrinth, written and directed by Guillermo del Toro. Del Toro often works within the dark fantasy genre, with his work being characterized by strong visual iconography, including insectile imagery and clockwork motifs. His intention with this is often to engage the audience with visual or poetic beauty. Del Toro stated that he considers Pan's Labyrinth to be the spiritual successor to his 2001 gothic horror film The Devil's Backbone. This is because important themes are shared between the two films, including obedience and war. Pan's Labyrinth presents the theme of disobedience with regards to war as the more favourable resolution, whereas The Devil's Backbone showcases submission as the only solution to war. Del Toro's intention here was to illustrate two contrasting responses to the situations in Francoist Spain and post-war Spain. Del Toro also wanted to include these themes because he felt that they were as urgent in the world today as they were in 1944. One theme in Pan's Labyrinth is the theme of time. Del Toro often includes clockwork motifs in his films. In Pan's Labyrinth, the task set to Ophelia by the faun demonstrates a sense of urgency. The director's intention here is to make the film more successful and compelling to watch. The themes of control and fascism are shown through the binary opposition of the fantasy world versus the real world. The fantasy world provides Ophelia with the opportunity to control her own destiny, which stands in sharp contrast to the real world where she is told what to do by Captain Vidal the fascist. The director's intention here is to familiarise the audience with the struggles of post-war Spain, since the contours of this theme can be mapped onto the decade in which the film was made, when once again power was in the hands of a notoriously incurious tyrant, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, who shared with Vidal both a desire to fill his father's shoes and a fondness for torturing enemy combatants. Del Toro uses camera work to emphasise the aforementioned binary opposition of the fantasy world versus the real world. Vidal is often shot in light, whereas the faun in his labyrinth are cast in darkness, as is Ophelia many times. This goes against many classic rules of cinema. The director's intention here was to reverse the audience's expectations and teach them to not be so distrustful of the darkness and the world it inhabits, because it's the real world in all its bright glory that's the damaged one. A major binary opposition used in Pan's Labyrinth is obedience versus disobedience. Del Toro uses the characters to portray each response in a different way. Ophelia's disobedience aligns her with the resistance, who are ennobled precisely for refusing either to do unquestioningly what they are told or to cave into the overwhelming force of tyranny. Del Toro's intention here was to portray disobedience in a positive light. However, Vidal the villain believes in blindly obeying the chain of command. The Doctor actually tells him to obey without thinking, just like that. That's something people like you can do, and that really sums up the entire theme in one sentence, and it portrays obedience in a negative light. Perhaps Del Toro's intention with this was to enable the viewer to give the viewer the opportunity to consider which they value more, obedience or doing what's right. It could be argued that Pan's Labyrinth follows the conventions laid out as touchstones by Vladimir Propp that must be hit in order to be viewed as a traditional fairy tale. The rule of three is an example of this. Each of the three central female characters, Ophelia, Carmen, and Mercedes' relationship with Vidal can be viewed as the three responses to a fascist regime. Carmen's weak acceptance, Ophelia's understated rebellion, and Mercedes' full-blown resistance of Vidal's ideologies and everything he stands for. We can clearly see Del Toro's intention for this with Carmen, a character who we pity, who provides a submissive response to a fascist regime. Another convention here is the eventual downfall of Vidal. The director's intention in conforming to this is so that the ending feels entirely satisfying and justified. Del Toro goes a step further by utterly destroying Vidal, and Vidal requests that his son be told the time of his death. However, Mercedes merely replies that he will never even know your name before her brother shoots him. As dictated by the tradition of the fairy tale, the villain is vanquished. Del Toro also decided to conform to many conventions attributed to a fantasy genre, including the conflict of good against evil, and the director's intention here was to make the film seem for the audience more magical like a fantasy, so that they can engage in the story more. Another way in which he decided to conform to the conventions of a fantasy is the representation of the forces of evil. Vidal, in compliance with the mainstay of a personified Dark Lord, is in possession of a great army and ends up drunken and physically scarred. Del Toro's intention here is to terrify the audience, keeping them on the edge of their seats. Alternatively, Del Toro rejected some other conventions of fantasy, for example the forces of magic. So, in classic fairy tales, fairies are good, helpful creatures. However, in Pan's Labyrinth, the director showed the fairies being carnivorous, and his intention here was to introduce ambiguity in magical creatures so that the audience would wonder whether they're good or bad. Pan's Labyrinth was set just after the end of the Spanish Civil War. In the film, Del Toro chose to display the essence of the war mainly as a household war, one that occurs within the walls of a building and between the members of a family, so to speak. And he does this to remind the audience that conflict is everywhere and not just in your history books. Del Toro also wanted to show that violence and the death of civilians in Civil War Spain and post-war Spain was completely inconsequential, and he thought that it was important to show that out of the approximately 500,000 people that died in the Spanish Civil War, over half of them were either summarily executed or killed in cold blood without battle engagements, and he did this by basing the first act of violence on an oral account of a post-war occurrence in a grocery store, where a fascist came in and a citizen didn't take off his hat. And the fascist proceeded to smash his face in with the butt of a pistol, and then he calmly took his groceries and left. And this scene is done with the action becoming more and more and more intense, and then it releases to a quiet moment to show that the death of these two guys is completely inconsequential. So Vidal just shot and killed them, and the audience can hear crickets chirping, and the train is moving in the distance, and it's not a big deal. And the first act of violence is the most violent, and from this point on, the violence gets more and more simple until the final death occurs in single shots and almost throwaway moments. Pan's Labyrinth opened to widespread critical acclaim. At its Cannes Film Festival release, it received a 22-minute standing ovation, one of the longest in the film's festival history. It also received a standing ovation at the 2006 Toronto International Film Festival, which was its first release in the Americas. Mark Kermode in The Observer labelled Pan's Labyrinth as the best film of 2006, describing it as an epic poetic vision in which the grim realities of war are matched and mirrored by a descent into an underworld populated by fearsomely beautiful monsters. It was produced and distributed by Esperanto Films, which had produced 3 not widely successful films beforehand, and this goes to show that it's Del Toro's genius and not the success of the production company that provided the film with all of its success. In conclusion, I feel as though Pan's Labyrinth is intended, and succeeds in most cases, upon having a powerful impact on whomsoever views it. I find that the legacy of Pan's Labyrinth secures its place proudly in cinema history as an accessible political fable in the disguise of a dark, twisted fairy tale. Pan's Labyrinth is so intensely important to cinema history because it's pioneered its specialist hybrid genre of dark fantasy.